Okay, well, looks like it's about time to get started. I just want to say thank you for everyone joining us on this call today. Um, the COVID-19 case for public pharmaceutical research and development, a really critical issue at this critical time. My name's Alex Lawson. I'm the executive director of Social Security Works. We represent 1.5 million people across the country, primarily seniors and people with disabilities who rely heavily on pharmaceuticals and have been bearing a lot of the brunt of outrageous prices on all prescription drugs for years. That's why we've been working on this issue as long as we have. Now, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we're also seeing that seniors and people with disabilities are disproportionately impacted by this pandemic, with case fatality rates that are astronomical, 10-15% among seniors and those with underlying health problems. So it's at this critical moment that we need to be looking forward. We can't look back because the system wasn't working for seniors, folks with disabilities, or really for anyone except for pharmaceutical executives for the past 40 years or so. But now with the failings, the just outright failing of the system to be able to have the mechanisms in place to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, which is the third coronavirus that we've seen over the past decade or 15 years. And yet here we are playing catch up again. I want to set the stage for our esteemed panelists who are going to be incredibly informative on this by just saying that we're not talking actually about anything new. It's not like we need to create public R&D for pharmaceuticals. We are discussing something that already exists right now that we need to recognize how much public resources go into the research and development, clinical testing of pharmaceuticals. And we need to imagine a new system and build that system going forward where we build upon what we have and we recognize the public investment in these pharmaceuticals and demand a public return on that public investment. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our first panelist, Dana Brown. She's the director of the Next Systems Project at the Democracy Collaborative. Dana?
Thank you so much, Alex, and thanks everyone for joining us today. As Alex alluded to, well, we sit here speaking with you from our respective home quarantines, readjusting our lives to meet the demand of the biggest public health crisis of our time, one that strains every part of our social and economic systems and whose consequences we will feel for decades to come. While we worry about our loved ones, our most vulnerable neighbors, and the capacity of our hospitals, millions of Americans and people around the world are rightfully asking, where's the vaccine? Where are the treatments? The answers to these questions are multifaceted, but one thing is crystal clear. Our for-profit medicine system is failing us, and the lack of a coronavirus vaccine is but one example of that. America has a drug problem. Well before the COVID-19 outbreak, millions were suffering and dying from lack of access to essential medicines, many of which were discovered long ago and cost only pennies to produce. A number of badly needed medications are not even being developed due to a lack of market incentives. At the same time, we suffer recurring shortages in essential medicines that are costly and dangerous, while other medications are pushed on to patients and marketed heavily to doctors despite dangerous side effects and the potential for addiction. These are systemic failures of market-based medicine to provide for the public good. This current crisis only puts a finer point on the problem. So what does this particular crisis illustrate about our medicine system? Number one, as our colleagues at Public Citizen illustrated so clearly in a recent report, we have gotten to 2020 without a viable coronavirus vaccine or treatment, despite the fact that this is the third time in the last 20 years we've had a dangerous coronavirus outbreak, the first being SARS and then MERS. This whole time, the public has been putting up considerable funding for R&D for infectious diseases, including $700 million in NIH investment on coronavirus alone. But we've been relying on the private sector to take interest and bring a drug to market. Vaccine development is a long and complex process, requiring sustained investment and interest, something that big pharma, incentivized most by the potential for short-term gains, is not well set up to do. During the past 50 years, companies devoted to manufacturing vaccines have been acquired by other pharmaceutical companies. The numbers of companies making vaccines dwindling from 26 in 1967 to 5 in 2004, with further consolidation since then. Because of these mergers, the companies that make vaccines have vaccines competing against other drugs for internal funding, and vaccines usually lose. Vaccines contribute little, if any, to these companies' bottom lines, so when they decide to stop making a vaccine or stop pursuing a new one, it does little to affect their shareholders, but it can have massive effects on public health. 2, even though there now appears to be great interest in coronavirus vaccine development, with announcements by a number of private pharmaceutical companies that they are actively engaging in R&D, the testing approvals process required to assure that we get a safe and effective vaccine means we're still probably 18 months away from seeing one on the market. Number 3, we have no assurances that that vaccine, once available, will be affordable. In fact, the final coronavirus spending bill that Congress passed earlier this month includes language which prevents the federal government from taking action to address vaccine prices and secure affordability, despite providing another $3 billion in public funding for R&D of coronavirus vaccines and treatments. And it's not unreasonable to think that Big Pharma, the most profitable industry in the United States with a track record of price gouging, will charge whatever it thinks the market can bear if successful in developing a vaccine. A marketized approach to essential medicines like vaccines can have huge and devastating effects globally, exacerbating existing health and economic inequalities. With the H1N1 flu back in 2009, the wealthiest countries put up exclusive contracts in place and monopolized vaccine supplies. We're already seeing tensions between the US and the EU arise, as it was reported that President Trump attempted to acquire exclusive rights to a German company's potential vaccine for coronavirus. But limiting access to vaccines through high prices and monopolies is, of course, terrible public health policy, particularly in an increasingly globalized world. Lastly, there is no guarantee that for-profit pharmaceutical companies will even see the coronavirus vaccine process through to a final product. After initial news of the previous coronavirus outbreak, a number of companies announced their new vaccine and therapeutics programs, and many of them saw their stock prices go up immediately. But they still failed to produce any coronavirus vaccine or treatments in the intervening years, and some have sold off or stopped these programs since. As reported in the Financial Times earlier this week, quote, several companies have lost money over vaccines developed for past outbreaks such as Ebola or SARS, whose epidemics were almost over before any products were ready, unquote. This hints that the motivation for private pharmaceutical development may not last long enough to produce a viable vaccine, even for this critical outbreak. What we've learned recently about the case of private sector involvement in the Ebola vaccine development should be particularly concerning. Back in 2014, when the outbreak was raging, a promising Ebola vaccine just sat on the shelf. The small company that licensed the vaccine from the Canadian government, who had funded the majority of the development, the small company failed to complete basic trials. It was only after that company further sub-licensed the vaccine to another company, another for-profit company, it was only then that clinical trials were done, delaying the much-needed vaccine for over a year, though it created substantial profit for the small company just the same. Furthermore, we've seen for-profit pharmaceutical companies pulling out in droves from other areas of research and development critical to public health, like the development of new antibiotics. This, even after very public promises to pursue R&D and all the tax breaks and subsidies that they could, and other perks that governments have thrown their way. Companies time and again cite a lack of market incentives. However, there's a clear public health incentive to assure new antibiotics are developed. It's estimated that drug-resistant bacteria could kill up to 10 million people a year by 2050. So the question remains, is the for-profit pharmaceutical model capable of meeting our public health needs? Or is it time to reclaim medicines as a public good? I'll leave it there because I think my colleagues' presentations will do a good job of answering that question for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dana. And next we will be going to Amit Sirpatwari, who is an assistant professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. Amit?
Thanks, Alex. Thank you, Dana and Democracy Collaborative for organizing this session. I hope everyone's doing as well as can be possible during this time. And I guess what I'm here to do is to talk just a little bit about the traditional model of drug discovery and development and take it from not only this issue of the crisis right now in COVID, but more broadly speaking of what the current system is and what its failings are. And so to go into that, I guess, hopefully you can all see my slides. But when we're talking about the traditional model of drug discovery and development, it's an incredibly long, risky, and expensive process. You can see in this one figure that you start with thousands of compounds that enter preclinical research. And even among those, let's say about 10 that out of those thousands that might enter phase 1 testing, you may, if you're lucky, end up with about 2 that actually make it through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 testing and ultimately get FDA approved. In this process, traditionally, basic and early stage science is funded by and conducted in academic or government laboratories before private investors and for-profit pharmaceutical manufacturers become involved in later stage development and commercialization of products. And so both parties are critical to this operation. But when you take a look at the basic and early stage translational science process, the NIH spent in 2009 $39 billion on research and development. That makes the NIH the largest funder of biomedical research in the world. And the real question is, what is the public getting from that return on investment of taxpayer money? The for-profit system is also taking a heavy hand in terms of it putting forward $90 billion. That's what pharma estimates in 2009 in industry spending. But increasingly what we've seen is a slight shift in this system. And so the contribution and the importance of the contribution of publicly supported research has grown over time. So if you take a look at from 2008 to 2017, over that 10-year period, publicly supported research contributed key late-stage support for the development of 25% of new FDA-approved small molecule drugs. So oftentimes you hear the discussion that, yes, there is a wealth of publicly funded science, but that's basic science. Here we're talking about key late-stage contributions contributing to the development of a fourth of all new drugs coming to market over the past decade. If you put that in context between the decade prior, that would be 14%. So you're seeing an increase of the importance of publicly supported research. And that includes federal de-risking initiatives. So the Clinical and Translational Sciences Program started in 2006, funded $2.2 billion in grants and contracts to 55 academic institutions. In 2011, you saw the establishment of NCAS, the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, which has an annual budget of $500 million. And what these entities are here to do is to make the process of drug development less risky. If we take a look now and do a cross-sectional evaluation of current gene therapy trials, active as of, January 2019, the biopharmaceutical industry sponsored or funded less than half. So we're seeing an increasing shouldering of what the public sector is doing. But these changes have not disrupted the core model that in the final stages of drug development, that the for-profit pharmaceutical sector takes over and then is able to charge whatever the market will bear. And so the real question is, what has been the outcome of this system? We're definitely getting more drugs, but the question is how good and for what conditions. So there's been an increasing number of drug approvals over time. If you take a look at the mean annual number of drug approvals from 1990 to 1995, there were 25. Between 2000 and 2009, 41. And oftentimes this is touted as a marker of success. There's been a great number of drugs approved. Now, some of these drugs have been clinically transformational. Take, for example, sofosbuvir for hepatitis C, or tisagenlecleucel for blood cancer. These are potentially curative treatments. But if we take a look at all new drugs approved by the FDA in 2017, about 2/3 were rated by expert organizations in Germany, France, and Canada to offer no or minor additional benefit over existing treatments. So there's a real question about the value of a lot of these products that are put forward. Perhaps most importantly for this conversation, there's also been a disproportionate focus of which drugs are coming to market. So in the context of antibiotics, the World Health Organization in January sounded an alarm regarding the insufficiency of the pharmaceutical pipeline to tackle antimicrobial resistance. Of 50 antibiotics in testing, only 2 were for multi-drug resistant gram-negative bacteria, the biggest infectious disease threat right now. We see this again with the COVID crisis in terms of our lack of preparedness in development of a vaccine. What pharmaceutical manufacturers are doing is logical. They are investing in those products that will reap the largest profits. And thus you see drug development disproportionately skewed towards oncology and orphan products, but away from risky and non-profitable markets, particularly emerging infectious diseases. It's not limited just to emerging infectious diseases, though we've also seen in terms of central nervous system disorders, many drug companies shutting down their R&D pipelines altogether. So for the drugs that society most needs, we are seeing a failing of the market in terms of investment of the pipeline in those products. If we take a look at not only those products that are being developed, but basically what we're spending on those products, the US spends the most globally per capita on prescription drugs. So there you see a figure, I think everyone is probably familiar with this at this point, that compared to countries like France, we're spending almost 2 times per capita on prescription drugs, despite contributing through taxpayer funding an incredible amount of the R&D engine that is developing these products. We're seeing record-setting launch prices of drugs. In 2011, the median annual list price of a new cancer medication in 2017 dollars, so taking into account inflation, was about $100,000. That had risen over 6 years to $160,000. Keep in mind that the median household income is less than $50,000. We've also seen routine price increases between 2007 and 2018. Branded drugs available, if you just take a look at branded drugs available before 2007, the list prices of those drugs increased 160%. Oftentimes we hear that, well, that's just list prices. But a recent study showed that actually, if you take a look at net prices after rebates are taken into account, the net prices have increased 60%. And so, as Dana alluded to, the profitability of large pharmaceutical manufacturers versus other companies, it's almost twice as large. So we're seeing great profit, we're seeing high prices, and that has led to problems with access. 1/3 of patients in a 2018 national survey reported that they were not able to take a medication as prescribed owing to cost. And so clearly our current system has fundamental problems and that there is fundamental reform that is needed. And today we'll talk a little bit about how development of a national public pharmaceutical research and development institute could provide some relief to this situation and provide better preparedness for what are ultimately public health and national security threats. Thanks.
Thank you, Amit. We will now actually view a video from Dr. Adam Gaffney, who's the president of Physicians for a National Health Program. Dr. Gaffney couldn't join us on the call today because he is covering for a colleague of his who is sick. I think we have the video queued up to go. This is, again, Dr. Adam Gaffney. We don't yet have sound, but we are working on it. Please bear with us. So in radio, this is stretch it out. I'll vamp for a little bit here as we work to get the video up. I think as we're going to hear from Adam, Dr. Gaffney, and all of the panelists, this is not a problem with a very difficult solution to find. Currently, as you saw, we are doing an enormous amount of public research and development, all the way from basic research through the entire cycle to late clinical trials, late stage clinical trials. And then for some reason, we have a system where after the taxpayers pay for all of this development, we hand a for-profit company a patent that enables them to charge whatever they want. The largest buyer of prescription drugs is the federal government. And so we are not only funding the research and development, I think we have sound now.
Hello, my name is Adam Gaffney. I'm the president of Physicians for a National Health Program, and I'm very sorry that I can't be joining you live today, Friday. I will be working in the intensive care unit tomorrow, so I've made this video for you instead. We are at a crisis moment in America right now. We have a pandemic that has affected all 50 states, and we don't know what the future holds. We know many nations have managed to contain this epidemic, but many nations, in particular Italy, are straining and buckling under pressure. Crises, I think, tell us, though, what we need to fix. And one of the things that we need to fix in this society is our medical care system. And the second thing we need to fix in this country is the way that we research, develop, and price pharmaceuticals. Right now, we don't have a cure for coronavirus. We don't have a vaccine, but we are going to be pouring money, billions of dollars, into research and development to produce cures, to produce vaccines. That's the way our system works in general. The National Institutes of Health fund the vast majority of the basic science that goes into finding cures, finding therapies. Then later on in the pathway, pharmaceutical companies run clinical trials, take out patents, and are able to sell drugs at more or less whatever the market will bear because they have those patents, and we let them do that. And the consequence of that is that we can't afford the drugs that our nation needs, on the one hand. And on the other hand, we can't shape the research priorities directly the way we should. There's a clear solution, and that's public financing of research and development of pharmaceuticals, of vaccines, not just in the early stages of the basic science, but all the way through to finding the molecules, to testing them in clinical trials. If we do that, the drugs belong to the public. They are in the public domain, and they can be produced and manufactured at the cost. No one will need to go without the medications that they require. There's an old model to this. It's not new. For generations, scientists have found cures without the hope of becoming billionaires. That was certainly the case with the discovery of insulin at the University of Toronto. It was certainly the case with the development of the polio vaccine. When Jonas Salk was asked who owned the patent, famously he replied, "The people. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun?" That is the model of research and development. That is the model of science. That is the model for developing new cures and new vaccines that we should be embracing today. We should absolutely pour public money into coming up with new, powerful, potent therapies to fight this virus and to combat all the other diseases that afflict us. But we should do so all the way through so that when we do develop a new cure with public money, when we do develop a new vaccine, we can make it available to all people without cost being a barrier. So I'm very happy to be joining you remotely today, and I'm looking forward to pushing onward with this campaign. Thank you.
So remotely, thanks to Dr. Gaffney for those remarks and also for his frontline service in the intensive care unit. I know that Dana Brown wanted to make a comment on Dr. Gaffney's presentation and also on the system, the next system that we can build, building on what we have today. Dana?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. I just wanted to reiterate something that Dr. Gaffney and Alex had both started to get at, which is considering medicines as a public good is consistent with kind of a multi-century global legacy. It's not a new idea. So when nations signed the 1883 Paris Convention, the 1886 Berne Convention, in 1967, when the UN World Intellectual Property Organization was created, it was deliberately decided that to exclude medications from the list of items that could be patented. For much of the 20th century, India was thought of as the pharmacy of the developing world, in part because the patents only covered the process for creating a medication rather than a medication itself. So scientists and local companies were able to reverse engineer medications reverse engineer on patent drugs and make generics available for very cheap prices to most of the world. A number of European countries didn't allow for patents protections on medications until the late 20th century, with Italy and Sweden holding out until the 70s and Spain until 1992. So just really quickly, both Amit and I have written about this before, and Dr. Gaffney's organization has as well, putting out a very similar plan. One obvious way to kind of get back to that system here in the United States would be to set up a new institute at the NIH, specifically mandated to focus on full cycle drug development for essential medicines, kind of just closing the loop. And we think that would benefit from close collaboration with existing NIH institutes that are already increasingly involved in late stage biomedical development, as Amit was talking about. But furthermore, this new institute should be committed to the highest levels of transparency, which also then kind of speeds up the innovation process itself. And the institute could be required to retain the rights on the medication it develops and reinvest the proceeds into further R&D. So just kind of creating this atmosphere in which we can reclaim medicines as a public good and utilize the resources that we're already pumping into this process, but utilize them in a way that's really focused on public good, the most pressing public health needs, and not the things that make the best quarterly returns.
Thank you, Dana. And Amit, did you want to add on the question of what the full cycle public R&D system might look like? Hold on one second, Amit, you're muted. We'll unmute you.
There we go. Sorry about that. I think Dana really hit on all of the points of what this public R&D institute could be. And the fact is, this is not revolutionary in terms of concept of the federal government taking on this type of role. If you look at historically NASA, DARPA, and the type of innovation that has come from publicly funded science led by the federal government, there is a clear pathway for this to happen. And there's also a clear pathway for this to exist alongside, at least now, the existing model, despite its failure, in terms of focusing on discrete areas of market failure. And here we're talking particularly about antibiotics. We're talking about emergency preparedness. We're talking about sectors of the market where there hasn't been the investment that's needed, based on the fact that those are not drugs that will typically see the profits that investors want. We need to be better prepared as a country because we know more public health challenges like this will happen. And it is a wise investment in terms of, it will require an upfront cost that will be considerable, but in terms of the savings that will be reaped, not only from access to affordable medications, of which federal payers are the ones who bear the brunt of the burden right now, but also in terms of just purely public health. If we were all prepared and were better equipped to have a vaccine in the early stages of this crisis, you can imagine what the cost savings would be for the country and for the global economy as a whole. And so I think having a commitment to contributing safe, adequate, and accessible supply of essential medicines in the US is something that Congress needs to focus on and tackle now. And it is a clear process that is achievable, given the extent of public sector involvement in drug development at this stage. What we're really talking about is closing the loop. And so I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Amit. Before we turn it over to Q&A, just a few, I'll take some moderator privileges to add a few words here. I think as an advocate working to advance the interests of seniors, folks with disabilities, I can state just a little bit more emphatically than than the panelists that it's not a question. The private market has failed the public health. There's no clearer indication than that than what we're dealing with right now. We are all locked in our homes. California just issued a stay-at-home order for 40 million people. There is a global pandemic raging that will crush the global economy with the loss of lives and money in an incalculable level. And it was entirely predicted. It was entirely predicted. We knew that a pandemic was coming, but the private market cannot produce the necessary goods to protect the public health. Why? Because it's not profitable. It is not profitable to prevent something from happening. They lose money. So this is not a market good. We need to understand that there are things that the private industry cannot do, that only we can do together when we come together as the government, which is us, the taxpayers, doing things. That's what we need to focus on. It's not just about the fact that we're getting ripped off by the pharmaceutical corporations, which we are. We pay to develop the drugs. We pay for the federal programs that are the largest buyer of the drugs. And then we pay the highest drug prices in the world. In the world, we pay to develop them, and then they turn around and charge us what the market can bear. And I want to tell you what that phrase means really clearly. What the market will bear means this. They charge prices on drugs like insulin, for example, which is over 100 years old, but they charge prices by forming a cartel and charge prices so that some people die, so that everyone else is terrified enough that they'll go bankrupt to afford the drugs that they need. That is a failed system. That was a failed system before the COVID-19 pandemic has shut down the world. We can't go back to a failed system that will charge outrageous prices after we do the research and leave us unprepared for the next public health emergency. It's not just seniors and folks with disabilities who are impacted by this current system, but I will say that seniors and people with disabilities are often the first and the most disproportionately impacted, which is why we've been working to transform this system for years, because it was apparent to everybody who takes pharmaceutical drugs and knows people who do that we need a new system. And the new system, again, is not revolutionary. As you heard from our panelists, we already do most of it. It's recognizing that and ensuring that we get the return on the public investment that we already need. It's recognizing that private companies who charge prices that are so high that people die because they can't afford it are abusing the patents that are granted to them as a privilege, and they can lose the privilege when they're abusing it, granting generic licensing so that other companies can come in and bring down the price with competition. That's one. It's as easy as 1, 2, 3. Two, we need to ensure that there is taxpayer-funded government manufacturing to deal with any shortage issues or national security like vaccines, and also to just not allow the pharmaceutical corporations to have a bottleneck or a stranglehold on the industry. And three, we need this full cycle government research and development with no patenting or open licensing at the end. And with those three pieces, we will have transformed the system so that the incentives are aligned with the public health. The private companies will continue to exist, but they will no longer be driving us away from the public health into massive profits for them and pandemics for the rest of us. Now, here's just in this current system, right now, we're going to start by saying there's no profiteering off of pandemics. We're not going to allow them to take the public resources that we put in, 700 million into the potential vaccine, 40 million into the most promising treatment that is out there. We're not going to allow them to take a monopoly and then jack up the prices as high as they go. But then after we stop them from doing that in this acute crisis, we're going to create a system that does not leave us right back here where we started when the next bug spreads around the world and becomes a pandemic. I think we have some questions coming in here. From an anonymous attendee, do any of the panelists have any books, media, recorded talks they'd recommend for the public on the webinar to watch to learn more about these concerns and topics? Dana, you want to take that one?
I was just going to offer that maybe the easiest way to deal with that was to share some links afterwards. We probably have lots of things we'd recommend there.
Perfect. Another question for Amit. You began to touch on this, but describe for us how vaccine production for COVID-19 would unfold if there was a full cycle drug development institute in existence right now.
Sure. So I think the first thing is critically putting dollars where the problems are. And I think right now the decision is really in the private market, putting dollars where the profits are. And that sometimes overlaps, but as oftentimes, particularly in the case of pandemics and infectious diseases, isn't going to align well with what we need. So in terms of how that works, I think what that means is taking an institute that could exist within NIH and taking forward basic science that has been promising and really advancing the clinical translational science aspect of that, including the late stage testing. And so what we're really talking about is advancing the product through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical testing. And it's operationalized in the sense of a protected budget. I think this is critical, not something that the Institute has to fight for each year, not something that the Institute has to do contracting for to achieve. And we can talk about problems with past private partnership, private-public partnership initiatives. But basically what we need is investment in emerging threats, and that is sort of protected research and development that could advance things through late stage clinical testing. And so you wouldn't be relying on industry partners to perform that, but rather it would be something within NIH that exists. When you're talking about these late stage trials, it is feasible for NIH to actually put this forward, to do this, to operationalize this. What's needed is the resolve on Capitol Hill. What's needed is the funding necessary to do this. But by allowing this freedom of the government to invest in actual public health threats, we would have invested in this because we knew that this was an emerging threat. And the likelihood of us already having a vaccine ready would have been, the probability of that would have been far higher than what we currently have right now.
Thank you. A question for Dana. Is there action on Capitol Hill to move this idea forward?
That's a great question. And if I may, I'm going to actually expand that question just a tad and say kind of what can the government do to address this problem? Because I always like to say, we spend a lot of time saying that, big pharma should do this. Pharmaceutical companies should lower their prices. Pharmaceutical companies need to get us the drugs we need. And I sustain that we, as in the people, the government, already has all the powers it could possibly desire to solve access to medicines issues, right? We could do everything from issue compulsory licenses on existing drugs that are priced out of reach, and make generic copies of them, to nationalizing the entire industry and putting it at the disposal of the public good, right? We have a long history of nationalizations during times of emergency. And there's a whole range of things in between. Amit and others can speak eloquently to existing legal tools like something called Section 1498 or Bayh-Dole March-in rights. There are plenty of mechanisms that allow the government to infringe upon patents and secure access to existing medications. And then what we're really talking about here is assuring that we close the loop on the investments that we're making into research and development for new medications, the things that we need now and that we're going to need in the future. But the possibilities are really multiple. I mean, there's a reason that oncologists at Sloan Kettering in the past have published around the idea of the government buying companies with promising technologies, right? We could buy out small biotech companies that are waiting to be bought by big pharma, but maybe what if the buyer is us, the public, and we put that research to public use? So I think the tools are really multiple. The thing that Congress could do at this time and should really consider is reviving this idea of full cycle development in the public interest. There was a bill that it was put forth back in 2004 to essentially do something like this. The idea could be brought back. It can be tailored to the current context, to the current existing structure of the NIH, and build upon what we have. But really, as Alex and Amit and everyone has been saying, the time is now to learn from the lessons of the past and ensure that in the future we're getting the drugs we need for the public and for the public good.
So we have a few questions here. I'm going to take one from Alex Zychek. There seem to be conflicting public accounts of the march-in rights and powers available to the federal government to break patents, i.e. 1498, Bayh-Dole fine print, etc. Which tools are available and most relevant with future vaccines? And I think that's for both of you. So whoever would like to take it first. Amit?
I'll take it. It's a great question. And I think that there are existing shortcomings with Bayh-Dole in the sense that you got to remember that there are multiple patents usually on a product, and it really depends that you could have potential ability because of federal funding providing or contributing to the development of a certain invention. You may have march-in rights over a certain product, over a certain patent, but not necessarily over the entire product. And so in that respect, march-in rights, there's also an ongoing debate that no NIH director has ever claimed that there is the ability to use march-in rights on the basis of cost alone. That's debatable, highly debatable, but there's existing barriers to the use of march-in rights. But Section 1498 is general government use of patents, and there is no barrier there. In the 1960s, you saw government use of 1498 for antibiotics. What is nice about Section 1498 is it's not as though you're you're purely seizing property, you have an obligation to provide a fair return to the patent holder. And what would be nice is actually more work into what a fair return actually would be. But the existing resource and ability for the federal government in the case of vaccines to draw upon 1498 to assert government patent use rights exists. No further action is necessary aside from the president saying that this is something that should happen. And this is clearly a potential space where it may be needed. I'll stop there. I think there's some other questions, but I'll see if Dana has anything to weigh in on this.
No, that's great. I was just going to type in, there's also some wonderful work from Jamie Love and the folks at Knowledge Ecology International about some of the other provisions in Bayh-Dole. I'll send around a link as soon as I can find it, where the government can also put basically on the front end, right? They can write into licensing agreements a restrictions such that we can assure affordability and access in the future. So there's not just the ability to march in after a private entity has claimed the patents or the rights to something. So that's another bit that might be really relevant in this particular context as we're thinking about how future drugs are developed and what the provisions should be for access. So I'll find that analysis and put that in the chat.
And there's another one by my colleague Aaron Kesselheim on a similar type of issue. But I think one thing that I want to plug really quickly is we've talked about obviously the threefold ways in which government action can provide relief and provide more assertive leadership in this sector. I think one of the lessons that people are going to draw from in terms of government use or reasonable conditions is well, wasn't there a failure of reasonable conditions with NIH's attempt during the height of the AIDS crisis? We've written a piece that re-explores that history and shows that the use of reasonable pricing for technology transfer from the government actually wasn't the failure that it's made out to be, but in reality, there were lessons to be learned in terms of the way it was implemented, but there was other existing happenings that sort of explain the evidence that is often cited that somehow these reasonable condition clauses affected industry's willingness to take on this technology and advance it forward. So I'm happy to share that piece with people if they're interested.
Great. We have a couple more questions here. I might take just 1 second on that one as well, which is we are talking about existing authorities, but for future vaccines that the question was about, I would also say that after this pandemic, it will be extremely reasonable to say that vaccines in particular need to be fully government taxpayer funded the entire way through, that the private industry has failed so fundamentally that there is no reason that we should even turn to them a little bit when it comes to vaccines. Because again, when you do some sort of cost benefit analysis here, the cost of a pandemic is we're going to have a global depression. So whatever the upfront cost that the public, the taxpayers put into vaccine development is going to be dwarfed by the cost of not doing enough, and that the private industry has failed. So I want to go, there's a couple more questions here. I think one of them, what are some advocacy-based organizations that webinar viewers could look to support, find ways to serve around what Amit and Dana have shared with us? We can put some of those in the links as well. I would say Social Security Works, my organization, we're advocacy, public citizen, Families USA, Indivisible, there's a coalition, Lower Drug Prices Now, and a bipartisan campaign, Drug Prices Are Too High. There's a lot going on, but we're gonna need a lot more as well. So we'll put some links up. And another question that's more on the advocacy side, a statement, we will return to the old system because politicians like Joe Biden receive money from big pharma. Shouldn't we only support candidates who reject this money? Anyone can answer that, but I'll also say from an advocate's point of view, we want to make pharma money toxic so that politicians reject it, and we're making progress on that. We do think that all politicians should take a pledge rejecting pharmaceutical money, but we also are recognizing that pharmaceutical corporations have been massive political donors for their entire existence relies on government granted monopolies. So their business model is to actually charge outrageous prices so that they can make outrageous profits, so much money, single drugs that make as much money as whole companies, Fortune 500 companies. And they take a teeny tiny piece of that and they throw it at politicians who then protect their monopolies so that they can charge these prices. So it is critical that we break down that cycle. And one way we can do that is by asking politicians to take a pledge to forego pharmaceutical money. And I think that is a strategy that a lot of advocates are employing. And then one question.
So I can jump in there real quick. Beyond donations, right? So the capture of big pharma, the capture of our political system, and also even of patient groups is extreme, right? And it's one of the reasons that a lot of us assume that certain progress hasn't been made on issues like drug pricing. But it's also therefore one of the reasons why we need alternatives. We need nonprofits and public institutions that are encroaching on big pharma's space and disrupting the market. Because it starts to build a way to contest that power. And it's also why we might want to think about things like these existing tools that can be played on the offensive, right? If you can use compulsory licensing to gain access to existing high-priced medicines while we're building up the public and nonprofit capacity to be cranking out the new medicines we need, this helps kind of balance the powers again and allow us to reorient the system towards public need and public good rather than just being subservient to these private needs.
So a question for Dr. Sirpatwari. Please comment on some of the problems in the past with public-private partnerships for pharma R&D and manufacturing.
Sure. And I think Dana can also weigh in here. But I think there are examples of successes of public-private partnerships. And I think one of the biggest ones is DNDi, Drugs for Neglected Disease Initiative. It's a nonprofit, but engages in public-private partnerships. But again, that focuses on an area of the market that most manufacturers are not that interested in from a profitable standpoint. So the success of public-private partnerships, when you're talking about the state and private entities, usually what has been the problem is that in theory, these are supposed to work by capitalizing on the efficiency and expertise of the private industry, but merging that with the sort of public mission of the state. But when the state is not assertive in its public mission or is captured by industry in terms of its public mission, you have significant problems. And historically, what you've seen with these public-private partnerships, and BARDA has been very successful in terms of public-private partnerships that have yielded results, but they are very fearful about in asserting that public mission and view it as really what our public mission is, just advancing the science, not making sure that what arises from that public science is accessible to the public. And there, what is critical is building into whatever organization you're going to have that may drive public-private partnerships, a clear governing framework that prioritizes affordability, that prioritizes access. Without that, you're going to repeat past failures. And I think that what it also raises is the willingness that maybe there are some areas of this in terms of emergency preparedness that public-private partnerships might be possible and might be helpful given that framework. But you've also got to recognize that perhaps this is not the best suited model, and a full cycle R&D model is actually, like Alex said, is actually what is really needed in the context of this particular issue. And so there has to be the political will and the political capital to engage and have that full sector or a full cycle system as a backup if you are saying perhaps let's try the public-private partnership model first. Ultimately, you have to have the will to push it forward in the interest of the public, and that may very well mean that public-private partnerships are not the way to go.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off that, thank you so much, Amit. I think a public-private partnership that's really relevant right now is CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, a Norway-based public-private partnership that was launched in, I think, 2017. One really interesting thing there is that there were a lot of requests, even from international organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières, that CEPI assure equitable access to the vaccines that it develops. And originally they seemed to support that idea, but apparently some of the private partners on the board really pushed back, and they've had to walk back that promise. And now they're saying things like equitable access during certain outbreaks. I mean, they're really walking back things. And I think it's one of those examples in which the public and the private partners in a partnership don't always have equal footing. And unless, as Amit says, it's extraordinarily clear from the get-go in the partnership what some of what the bottom line is and how we're measuring success. Is success measured by how much profit the partnership is able to produce, or is the success based wholly on the kinds of public health indicators that we really need? So for instance, we've got the most profitable healthcare system in the world, but is profit what we care about right now? Or do we care about, do we have enough doctors and enough nurses, and do they have enough masks and ventilators and beds, right? So the way we measure success needs to be thought of really critically in a context like healthcare, and the medicine system is a critical piece of that.
And if I could just weigh in, I mean, one way you can conceptualize it is there are different groupings of categories of public-private partnerships. And you've seen there's access public-private partnerships that have mostly focused in the developing world, pre-competitive public-private partnerships, and product development public-private partnerships. You typically have considerable challenges with product development, I'm just going to say PPPs because I can't keep saying it, where we've seen more success is the pre-competitive PPPs, where for some reason a critical piece of maybe funding initiative is lacking from the private sector, but the public sector can provide that, but there isn't this huge battle over the IP that may result. That can yield very meaningful science, but when you're talking about product development, it becomes a little bit more challenging, and there the rules of the game have to be made very clear in advance if those are going to succeed.
Thank you so much. So I think I'm not getting any more questions, so I want to go around for closing remarks if that is good with the panelists. Dana, do you want to, who wants to go first? Dana, do you want to
Sure,
go first?
I'll jump in, and I'll probably still align from things that Amit and I have already written together. But essentially, remember that the public sector here in the United States has an extraordinary track record of success in innovation, right? We put people on the moon. We helped build the International Space Station. We created the internet and GPS. Imagine what would be possible if we really wielded that kind of potential for our medicine system, right? Imagine a world in which we're not having to react to this kind of catastrophe, but we're prepared in advance because we took the human resources and the incredible power of innovation that we have in this country, and we harnessed it in a way where we were focused on meeting needs, right? And anticipating public health needs rather than meeting the needs of shareholders in the short term. So I think that's really my plea. And as everybody has said today, it's simple. It's sort of going back to an old way of thinking about things, and knowing that that's the way forward. So thank you.
Amit?
Yeah, I guess at the end of the day, we have an unsustainable system. We have a system that is reactive. We have a system that doesn't get us what we need, and particularly for the most vulnerable among us. And there is a clear solution. And for the first time in a long time, there is an opening to advance this solution. And it's advancing it in the spirit of public health, but national security as well. There should be the capital now to push this forward. And I think we owe it to society at large to advance this as far as possible. It's something that is feasible, it's within our grasp. And what really is essential as we advance this is the narrative, because we are going to hear from the private sector that this will chill innovation, that this will be catastrophic. But I think there are clear examples from history that show that that's not the case. And there are clear examples to learn from that show that success is within our grasp. And so I think part of this is putting forward the evidence from a scientific basis, but part of this is storytelling as well. And the clear storytelling is where we find ourselves in a situation that we really don't need to be in currently. And what that means is that we need to push forward reform, and we need to do so in a timely way. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So I know that there'll be, this recording will go out, is available. The slides will be available. We will put links to answer some of those questions, and also our contact information for if you want to get in contact to continue the conversation. I will close out the call by just stating that we know what the next system looks like. We know what's needed. And I don't think you can actually find any better evidence of the failings of the current system than what we find ourselves in right now. We are facing a global pandemic, but it's not unprecedented. It's happened before. In fact, it's been predicted for decades that it would happen again. And yet the system that we have set up, where shareholder value is the only metric that's used to measure success, has left us critically vulnerable to a pandemic. And so there is no question left. We tried this other system where we left the private markets to, direct resources. They've failed the public health. And what we need is a public pharmaceutical system that is driven to innovate and manufacture and have access for all of it, driven by the public health. We know how to get there. We just need to build the political will to do so. And I do think that now where people are seeing the failings so clearly is when we can build that political will. So in closing, I will just say, wash your hands, don't touch your face, stay incredibly well hydrated, and with solidarity, we can get through anything. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks, everyone.